The first German prisoners walked into Camp Concordia, Kansas on July 4, 1943. For 6 days, their only food had been watery cabbage soup. When the mess hall doors opened at 1700 hours, they were met with a sight that seemed impossible. Sergeant Wilhelm Müller from the 21st Panzer Division stopped short, just feet from the serving line. He would later tell British interviewers that he thought the tables were set up for a propaganda photo. But it was real. Each tray held a full meal. 12 ounces of pot roast, 4 ounces of mashed potatoes, 60 grams of green beans, 2 dinner rolls, butter in a paper cup, and a slice of apple pie. The contrast was brutal. Back in North Africa, Müller's rations, according to German logistics records, were 300 grams of bread, 120 grams of a meat substitute, and 15 grams of fat per week. The American soldiers guarding him averaged 3,200 calories a day. On the Tunisian front, even German frontline troops were lucky to get 1,250 calories on a good week. The prisoners ate in silence, cleaning every scrap. Then, Müller did something that would be repeated all across the mess hall. He folded his napkin around 2 leftover bites of bread and slipped them into his shirt. Around him, 240 men did the same. Pockets bulged with rolls, apple cores, and butter cups. The American kitchen staff watched. When a private asked if they should clear the tables, the mess officer, Lieutenant Howard Chen, said, "No." His duty log contained a simple note: "Let them learn." The next morning, the hoarded food was discovered, bread hardening under bunks, butter melting into uniform pockets. During a barracks inspection, a German officer, Oberleutnant Ernst Becker, was found to have hidden 4 rolls in his pillowcase. The camp interpreter noted the man's explanation. Prisoner states he was saving for when rations stop. This fear was rooted in their experience. They were operating on a logic of scarcity, a deep-seated belief that such plenty could not last. They had no framework to understand that this was not a temporary feast, but the normal, regulated standard of the U.S. Army. The Geneva Convention required captors to feed prisoners equivalently to their own garrison troops, and the Americans were following this rule to the letter, backed by an agricultural and industrial machine they couldn't yet comprehend. Breakfast on July 5th, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, orange juice, only deepened the confusion. Müller's diary, written in broken English, recorded his disbelief. Eggs again, they give yesterday too. He was sure it was a mistake. The guards told him it wasn't. Everyday eggs, they said. His body rebelled against the shock of such rich food. He ate 6 pieces of toast and drank 3 cups of coffee, then vomited an hour later behind the latrine. The camp medical log showed 43 similar incidents that first week. Digestive systems starved for months were overwhelmed by fat and protein. The hoarding didn't stop. It became more organized. A systematic smuggling network sprung up. Prisoners transferred food during work details, burying it in hidden caches. One such stash, found near the motor pool, contained 87 bread rolls, 23 partially eaten steaks, and 14 apples, all beginning to rot. The camp commandant, Colonel Paul Neufeld, met with the prisoner liaison committee. His notes from the meeting survive. He informed them, through an interpreter, that the food supply was permanent. He was met with silence. Their spokesman had 2 questions. How long is permanent? The answer, indefinite. His follow-up, what does indefinite mean? The meeting ended. Trust, they would learn, would not come from words. It would only come from relentless daily repetition. The repetition began. Week 2, the same portions. Week 3, the same. The sheer, unchanging consistency of the meals started to wear down the prisoners' ingrained anxiety. The fear of shortage, once a fundamental part of their survival instinct, began to lose its edge against the daily, undeniable evidence of abundance. The shift in Sergeant Mueller's diary entries tells the story. The tone of shocked disbelief slowly gives way to a bewildered acceptance. On July 14th, he notes, "Steak again, they not run out." By July 18th, it's eggs every morning, maybe is Kansas rich place only. And on July 22nd, a question that hints at a dawning realization. Butter every meal. Where they get so much? The answer was all around them, 200 kilometers northwest in the vast wheat fields of Kansas. The state was in the middle of a record-breaking harvest in 1943, producing 241 million bushels of wheat. Its beef cattle inventory stood at 3.8 million head. This wasn't an accident. It was peak wartime production, driven by government price supports. The Ellsworth Milling Company, which supplied the camp, was running 3 shifts to keep up. The prisoners, trapped by their experience of a European war economy, were struggling to comprehend a system that operated on a principle of surplus, not scarcity. The camp's monthly food expenditure, documented in county procurement records, was staggering. The sum spent to feed 2,400 prisoners for a month would have fed an entire German regiment of 2,500 men for 3 months under their own logistics planning. Behavior began to change, first gradually, then suddenly. Camp inspection reports from August noted a sharp decrease in food hoarding. Mueller's diary entry from August 9th is a quiet landmark. "I leave bread on plate today. Mornings still come. Food still there." The psychological shift happened in visible stages. First, the men stopped taking extra rolls from the serving line. Then they stopped hiding the individual buttercups. By September, a new behavior emerged. They began refusing second helpings when offered. The constant, reliable abundance was systematically dismantling their fear. Without that fear, their appetites found natural limits. But not for everyone. The story of Gefreiter Hans Lehmann, captured in Italy, serves as a tragic counterpoint. A survivor of the brutal siege on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1941-42, a time when German rations dropped to 200 grams of bread a day, and men resorted to eating leather. Lehmann could never internalize the concept of a permanent supply. Every inspection found rotting food hidden under his mattress. His camp psychological evaluation notes persistent trauma indicators, and concludes that his survival behavior is too deeply ingrained. For him, the fear was a permanent wound. The ultimate testament to this psychological transformation came during a Red Cross inspection in November 1943. The prisoners themselves lodged an unusual complaint. The portions were too large. Men were gaining too much weight, an average of 8 kilograms in 4 months. Some were formally requesting smaller servings to avoid becoming fat. The Swiss inspector, Dr. Friedrich Bauer, noted the profound irony in his report. Prisoners expressed concern about overfeeding. This observer has never encountered such complaint in 40 camp inspections across 3 continents. The system had proven itself. The food supply never faltered. By spring of 1944, hoarding had effectively ceased. Muller's final entry on the subject, in April 1945, is simple and definitive. "We eat normal now, like is always there, because it is." The realization was complete. The war outside was still raging, but within the fences of Camp Concordia, a different truth had taken root. They were captives of a nation that possessed so much. It could feed its enemies better than they had ever fed themselves. The realization born in Camp Concordia did not remain isolated. It spread through the American POW camp system, carried by new arrivals from other fronts, each wave of prisoners bringing their own deeper levels of deprivation and disbelief. In October 1943, Camp Alva, Oklahoma, received 3,000 veterans of the Africa Corps. Their physical condition was far worse than that of Concordia's first inmates. Their average weight was a gaunt 58 kilograms, a stark drop from their pre-capture average of 72. Medical officer Captain Robert Chen documented the violent reaction to their first American meal. 17 cases of acute gastric distress. These men, coming directly from British-run cages in Tunisia where rations were minimal, consumed food with a frantic speed, driven by a terror that it would be taken away. One prisoner ate until he lost consciousness and required hospitalization. The Geneva Convention existed on paper, but its implementation depended entirely on the captor's supply chain. For the men at Alva, the adjustment was a slower, more meticulous process of recalibration. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, 15th Panzer Division, kept a secret record he called his Mengenliste, a quantity list, on a piece of cardboard hidden in his boot. Its fading pencil entries track his journey from disbelief to awe. October 18. Meat, 340 grams weighed on medical scale. Guard allowed. Impossible number. October 25. Counted 8 eggs this week. 8. October 31st. American private on guard duty eating sandwich. Threw half away. Half. Watched him do this. November 7. They feed us same as their soldiers. Confirmed by comparing trays through fence at guard mess. Same portions. November 15. Butter ration larger than weekly Wehrmacht officer allowance. Daily. November 22nd. 3 men in my barracks now refuse breakfast. 2 full from yesterday. The most powerful psychological breaking point often came not from what they were given, but from what they saw Americans discard. At Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, a work detail witnessed kitchen staff scraping pounds of uneaten food into waste bins every single day. At first, this was interpreted through the lens of scarcity. A prisoner named Martin Schultz reported it to his barracks as evidence of an impending shortage, a theory the prisoner council initially entertained. They are hiding the true supply situation by disposing of evidence, he argued. But the waste continued, week after week. The sheer consistency of the profligacy forced a cognitive shift. By December, Schultz's interpretation had inverted completely. They waste because they have too much, he concluded. This is not hiding shortage, this is normal for them. This observable waste ratio profoundly shocked the German logistics officers among the prisoners. Major Friedrich Wolf of the Quartermaster Corps clandestinely calculated Camp Chaffee's food waste at 18 to 22% of the total supply. He managed to smuggle a report to German intelligence through a coded Red Cross letter. A decoded excerpt, later captured by Allied signals intelligence, reads, "American supply capacity exceeds frontline need by comfortable margin. Waste indicates production surplus, not scarcity management. Implications for war sustainability assessment require revision." The contrast became formal teaching material. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, Hauptmann Otto Bremer, a former instructor at the Wehrmacht Logistics School in Munich, organized unauthorized lectures for his fellow officers. His confiscated notes lay out the core lesson. American system operates on abundance principle, German system on scarcity management. Abundance permits waste, inefficient but psychologically stable. Scarcity demands efficiency, optimal but creates hoarding behavior and distrust. Americans win logistics war before first shot. They feed prisoners better than we fed frontline troops. They were learning that the war had not been lost on the battlefield alone, but in the wheat fields of Kansas and the stockyards of Chicago, long before they ever became prisoners. The end of the war did not bring an end to the lesson for the German POWs. The surrender in May 1945 arrived not as an abstract political event, but as a concrete reality they were living inside. At Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the news of Germany's capitulation reached the prisoners during their evening meal. A silence fell over the mess hall. Then, someone laughed, a sharp, cracked sound. "We lost," he said in German, a statement later translated by the guards. "And we eat like kings." The irony was etched into their very bodies. After 17 months of American rations, the average prisoner had gained 14 kilograms. The uniforms they had been captured in no longer fit. They were living, breathing evidence of the material imbalance that had decided the conflict. The final brutal accounting came with repatriation. In the spring of 1946, as American-held prisoners were transferred to British and French control for processing back to Europe, the food changed immediately. At Camp 2227 near Cherbourg, Klaus Weber's cardboard list resumed its grim tally. May 3, bread 400 grams, soup thin, no meat. May 4th, same. May 5th, same. He scrawled a final, bleak conclusion. The American time is finished. Medical examinations at the processing centers tracked a swift reversal. U.S. Army Medical Corps reports documented an average weight loss of 1.2 kilograms per week among the transferring prisoners. A German physician working under Allied supervision noted, "Metabolisms adapted to American rations cannot adjust to European scarcity in a healthy time frame. We are processing men whose bodies remember abundance but must relearn deprivation." They carried this memory home like a piece of shrapnel, a persistent internal fragment of a different world. Wilhelm Müller returned to Dusseldorf in August 1946. He was heavier than his capture weight, but lighter than his release weight from Concordia. His first meal at home was potato soup with no meat and bread with turnip jam. His mother apologized for its meagerness. He ate in silence, then spoke the only English phrase he used in her presence: "Is enough." His diary entry that night, the last in the American section, read, "She does not know what enough means now. Neither do I." This cognitive dissonance became a shared, defining experience for the veterans. Their reunions throughout the 1950s, documented in German Veterans Association records, obsessively returned not to battles or tactics, but to the American food, the portions, the butter, the sheer, incomprehensible scale of it. For some, like the chronic hoarder Hans Lehmann, the psychological scars never healed. His 1951 psychiatric evaluation from a Cologne hospital stated he exhibited persistent anxiety regarding food security despite adequate post-war supply, and reported intrusive thoughts about American camp meals. He repeatedly told his doctors, "They fed us better than we fed ourselves." That single sentence, in 9 words, contained the war's verdict. The prisoners had been witnesses to the future in the middle of a starving continent. Their testimonies, initially dismissed as propaganda, were slowly validated as data on American agricultural production emerged. West German Economic Ministry briefings from 1948, assessing the feasibility of the Marshall Plan, cross-referenced prisoner accounts with USDA data and found them to be accurate. One assessment noted, American agricultural output exceeded combined Axis production by 340% in key categories. The camps became both legend and a stark warning. Concordia rations entered German military vocabulary as shorthand for the logistical superiority that made tactical genius almost irrelevant. Bundeswehr logistics manuals from 1956 referenced U.S. POW feeding standards as a benchmark for sustainable force projection. The lesson was clear. Logistical superiority enables strategic patience. An enemy who feeds prisoners at 3,200 calories possesses reserve capacity beyond our offensive reach. But the personal memories cut deeper than any doctrine. Klaus Weber kept his cardboard Mengenliste until his death in 1973. His son found it among his effects. In the margin, the former prisoner had scratched calculations of an alternative history. If we had fed troops like this, war ends 1942. Victory or collapse. Either way, faster. Wilhelm Müller gave his final interview in 1998. When asked about his combat experience, he redirected the conversation. "You want to know about the war? I'll tell you about the war. On July 4th, 1943, I walked into an American mess hall and thought the tables were decorated. They gave me this every day for 700 days. We lost because they could do that. Feed prisoners like officers while fighting on 4 continents. Everything else is commentary." The fighting had killed millions, but the feeding had revealed who could sustain the fighting indefinitely. The prisoners learned this lesson at 1,700 hours daily, 1 tray at a time, until it became body memory. They learned the feel of enough, then more than enough, then so much that enough lost all meaning. They carried that feeling home to a continent that had forgotten what it felt like. Some never forgave the knowing. Most never forgot the taste. The legacy of the American POW camps did not fade with the repatriation ships or the rebuilding of Germany. Instead, it seeped into the foundations of the new post-war order, a quiet, unshakable testament to a power that was measured not just in bombs, but in bushels of wheat and pounds of butter. In the starving landscape of post-war Germany, the returning prisoners were living anomalies. They were healthier, heavier, and carried with them the tangible memory of a system that did not operate on the brink of collapse. Their stories, once dismissed as defeatist fantasy, began to carry a heavy weight as the reality of the Marshall Plan took hold. When American agricultural exports flooded the occupation zones in 1947, abruptly lifting the daily caloric intake in the American zone to 2,300, it was a nationwide echo of that first meal in Concordia. The prisoners had not been lied to. They had been shown a preview. This first-hand witness to American abundance gave former POWs an unexpected authority. West German Economic Ministry files from 1948 reveal that their accounts were no longer dismissed, but were used as qualitative data. Planners cross-referenced their detailed descriptions of camp rations with official USDA production figures from 1943 to 45. The briefing notes contain a stark admission. Prisoner accounts of U.S. supply standards, initially deemed exaggerated, confirms accuracy. Enemy fed our soldiers better than we did. This was no longer just a personal shock. It was a geopolitical fact. The camps of plenty entered the German military consciousness as a permanent lesson. By the 1950s, Concordia rations became shorthand within the newly formed Bundeswehr for the devastating material advantage enjoyed by the United States. It was a lesson that went beyond firepower. A 1956 Bundeswehr logistics manual explicitly referenced U.S. POW feeding standards as a benchmark for what a modern, sustainable military logistics chain should aspire to. The manual concluded, "Logistical superiority enables strategic patience. An enemy who can feed prisoners at 3,200 calories daily possesses reserve capacity beyond any single offensive's reach." The war was decided here, before it was decided on the battlefield. But for the individuals who lived through it, the memory was more intimate and more painful than any doctrinal lesson. It was a knowledge that separated them, even from their own families. Klaus Weber, the man who kept the meticulous cardboard list, preserved it until his death in 1973. When his son found it among his effects, he saw not just the faded pencil marks comparing American plenty to Wehrmacht scarcity, but the desperate calculations scratched in the margins. His father had tried to solve the war mathematically. If we had fed troops like this, war ends 1942. Victory or collapse. Either way, faster. It was the anguished conclusion of a logistician who had seen the truth in the weight of a piece of meat. The last survivors carried this knowledge into old age. Wilhelm Müller, in his final interview in 1998, reduced the entire colossal conflict to a single, searing memory of a mess hall in Kansas. He bypassed the Eastern Front, the battles, the ideology, and went straight to the plate of food. For him, the entire war was encapsulated in the 700 days of meals that followed. "We lost because they could do that," he stated, his judgment final. "Everything else is commentary." The camp at Concordia itself was dismantled, its land repurposed for the very agriculture that had sustained it. The mess hall was torn down in 1963 to make room for larger grain silos, a fitting end for a place that was ultimately a monument to American harvest. The local historical society preserved a single artifact, a standard U.S. Army-issue metal serving tray, its compartments a silent map of a meal that reshaped minds. The plaque beneath it reads, "Camp Concordia, 1943 through 1946. They came as enemies, left understanding the distance between us." That distance was measured in the grams of butter they couldn't bring themselves to believe in, the ounces of steak that seemed like a trick, and the calories that rewrote their understanding of power. The war had been won by soldiers, but it had been revealed by farmers and quartermasters. The prisoners learned this not through a speech or a document, but through the slow, steady, and shocking experience of being full, day after day, until their bodies and minds could no longer deny the truth. They returned to a shattered continent not just as defeated soldiers, but as prophets of a coming age of abundance, carrying a bitter, full-stomached wisdom that their homeland was only beginning to imagine. The legacy of the American POW camps transcended national borders and the immediate post-war years, evolving into a broader, more profound commentary on the nature of power and the human psyche in the 20th century. The experience of German POWs became a unique, controlled case study in the psychological impact of abundance after prolonged deprivation, a phenomenon that would echo in the lives of survivors from other conflicts and catastrophes. For the prisoners, the return to a normal life in a war-ravaged Europe was, in many ways, a more difficult captivity than the one they had left in Kansas or Oklahoma. They were now free, but they were surrounded by a scarcity that felt like a regression. The memory of the American camp became a private, internal standard against which their new reality was measured, and it always fell short. This created a peculiar form of exile. They were physically home, but a part of their consciousness remained in those well-fed, orderly camps, creating a dissonance that time struggled to erase. Academic and psychological circles began to take note. By the late 1950s, studies on starvation and its aftermath, such as the famous Minnesota starvation experiment, provided a scientific framework for what the POWs had lived through. Their bodies had undergone a rapid refeeding syndrome on a mass scale, but their minds had undergone a parallel process. Psychologists identified a specific anxiety among these veterans, a scarcity trauma that persisted long after the physical threat had passed. They had been conditioned by one system and then forcibly shown the fundamental fallacy of that conditioning. The deeply ingrained hoarding behavior of men like Hans Lyman was not just a personal quirk. It was a predictable pathology of a collision between two economic worlds.
The testimonies of these men also served as a powerful, if unintended, Cold War narrative. As the Iron Curtain descended, the story of the well-fed prisoners stood in stark contrast to the emerging reports of the Gulag. American authorities, while not having orchestrated it as propaganda,
quietly recognized the power of this narrative. It was an unassailable truth. The nation that could feed its enemies with such profligate generosity was a nation of unimaginable strength and stability. The Marshall Plan was the macroeconomic expression of the same principle demonstrated in the Camp Concordia mess hall: the strategic use of surplus to secure influence and foster stability. For the children of these prisoners, the war stories they heard were different. They did not hear tales of glorious charges or heroic last stands. They heard their fathers speak, with a kind of reverent bewilderment, about the texture of white bread, the color of real butter, the sheer number of eggs. These were the fairy tales of their childhood, not stories of dragons and knights, but of a land of impossible, endless food. This generational transmission shaped perceptions of America not just as a political ally or a military power, but as a mythical place of material comfort, a perception that would fuel decades of immigration and cultural fascination. In the end, the most enduring legacy was etched not in history books, but in the daily habits of the men themselves. Long after the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle, had brought prosperity to West Germany, many of these former POWs retained the habits formed in captivity. They never wasted food. They ate slowly, savoring each bite with a mindfulness that spoke of a time when every calorie was a gift. They could not look at a full plate without seeing its shadow, the empty plates of their past, and the overfull trays of their captivity. Wilhelm Müller's simple phrase, "is enough," uttered to his apologetic mother, became a lifetime mantra. It was a statement of fact, a quiet rebellion against the ghost of scarcity, and a permanent memorial to the 700 days that redefined his understanding of the world. The fighting had stopped in 1945, but for these men, the war truly ended only when they finally, fully, believed that the morning would come and the food would still be there. For some, that day never came. For others, it was a hard-won peace, signed not on a battleship, but on a metal tray, one meal at a time. In the end, the most profound legacies were not in the National Archives or the psychiatric evaluations, but in the quiet, personal reckonings that haunted the prisoners for the rest of their days. The war ended on paper in 1945, but for these men, the conflict resolved into a series of private, unresolvable equations, the arithmetic of a lost war, scratched on the hidden surfaces of their lives. Klaus Faber's cardboard Mengenliste was more than a diary. It was a forensic document. The faded pencil marks were not just a record of American abundance, but a meticulous indictment of the system he had served. By listing the Wehrmacht rations alongside the American ones, he was building a case. In the margins, his calculations were a ghost of a different history. If we had fed troops like this, war ends 1942. Victory or collapse. Either way, faster. This was the logistician's final, bitter conclusion. The war had not been lost to a superior general or a braver soldier, but to a simple, insurmountable deficit of calories and industrial confidence. The enemy's strength was not just in their armies, but in their soil, their silos, their willingness to throw away half a sandwich. This arithmetic of defeat became a silent obsession for many. They were men who understood systems and logistics, and they had been presented with irrefutable data, served to them 3 times a day. They couldn't refute it. They could only live with the cognitive dissonance. They had fought for a Reich that promised a 1,000-year future, but could not provide a weekly meat ration,
while their captors, fighting a global war on two fronts, operated with the unshakable confidence of a system that had already solved the problem of scarcity. For men like Hans Lyman,
the chronic hoarder, the arithmetic was too painful to compute. His mind remained trapped in the winter of 1941, where the equation was simple: hoard or die. The American data was an anomaly his psyche could not integrate. His subsequent life, marked by anxiety around food despite the post-war boom, was a living testament to a trauma that abundance could not cure. His psychiatrist's note, "Survival behavior too deeply ingrained," was a clinical verdict on the limits of human adaptation. The collective memory of the POWs forged a new, pragmatic strain of thought in post-war Germany, particularly in the West. Their first-hand experience made them deeply skeptical of grand ideological visions built on promises of future sacrifice. They had seen the other side, and it was made of beef and white bread. This fostered a quiet, persistent advocacy for the practical, the material, and the sustainable. When they spoke of America, it was not with the anger of a defeated enemy, but with the sober respect of an engineer who has seen a better machine. This attitude subtly influenced the new Federal Republic's alignment towards transatlantic partnership and a social market economy, a system that prioritized delivering tangible prosperity, a national version of the enough they had experienced in the camps. The final, lingering question that haunted the survivors was one of complicity. Had they been fighting for a cause that was not only morally bankrupt but logistically doomed from the start? The sheer, wasteful, generous bounty of the American camps answered with a silent, damning yes. To be fed better as a prisoner than as a free soldier in the field was the ultimate indictment of the regime they had served. Mueller's declaration, "They fed us better than we fed ourselves," was an apology to his own starving nation, a eulogy for his cause, and a 9-word history of the war's deepest truth. The serving tray preserved by the Concordia Historical Society is not merely a relic. It is a calculator. Its compartments, once filled with pot roast, potatoes, and pie, hold the variables of a new equation of power. The prisoners who ate from it became unwilling mathematicians of a new world order, their lives spent trying to solve the problem of that impossible plenty. They carried the answer home with them, not in their minds, but in the very fiber of their being, a knowledge written in the language of sustenance, a fluency in the grammar of enough, a bitter, nourishing truth they could never forget.